Hey, welcome everyone to Phil Talk, and today we're actually having our first hosted debate on the platform, so I'm excited for that. And it's on the topic that I have a lot of content on the problem of evil. So we're sort of honored to have Joe Sonseed and Kyle. It says Alander, but I thought for some reason I thought it was Alexander, but it's Alander. Christian Idealism. He has a channel called Christian Idealism. He has a lot of good content over there for people that are more theistically minded. So let's just do a little brief introduction for each of y'all, maybe a little bit about your background, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Joe, you want to go first?
Sure. So Joe Sonseed, it's my handle I use online. I like debating the topic of atheism, and it's made it so I've been interested in things like philosophy of religion. So I know that one of the biggest arguments in the philosophy of religion with respect to theism is the problem of evil. So I enjoy debating that.
Awesome. Go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, Kyle.
Yeah, so I run a YouTube channel called Christian Idealism. My main focus is the philosophy of mind, although I definitely do philosophy of religion, especially with my most recent videos. Problem of evil, again, like Joe, I agree that is a very, very important topic. And currently I'm getting my degree in my main study right now, I'm focusing a lot on the philosophy of science, and that'll sort of overlap with what I have to say today. But yeah, that's basically what I do is I defend theism, I defend idealism as well as a metaphysical view. And so, yeah, that's basically what I do on my channel.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, guys. So with that, here's the setup of the debate. We're going to do 15-minute openers. We're going to start with Joe, since he's kind of presenting the problem, and then naturally Kyle's going to be kind of responding to the program. Then we're going to have like a cross-examination / discussion that kind of kicks off with Joe. Y'all put your questions. I can actually, StreamYard has put a feature where I can now save comments, save questions. So if there's a collection of questions, we'll proceed to that. If not, we'll do our closing statements, and that'll be it. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick myself out. I'm going to kick Kyle out, and we're going to go with Joe's presentation. Thanks, y'all, for viewing this this first kind of time we're doing this open kind of debate style and Phil Talk. So. All right, Joe, you can go ahead and begin.
All right. Thank you, Danny, for hosting this, and thank you, Kyle, for agreeing to this. I'm going to give this presentation, give the argument from evil, give some background, and undercut a few issues that I think might arise. But it's going to be a shorter presentation. I'm hoping to really flesh things out in the back and forth, and do so even more with the Q&A if there's a lot of Q&A. So like I said, here's the presentation I'm going to give, and I'm going to probably end with a few comments. So the problem of evil, there's nothing original with what I'm about to say. The problem of evil is an argument that's used against this classical understanding of the God of theism. And so I'm going to give some definitions on these slides. Here we go. This is a problem for people who believe in the existence of a God who has roughly these qualities. There's three main qualities that are important with respect to the problem of evil. The God in question is all powerful, he's all knowing, and he's perfectly good or wholly good. There's some other things about this God. They're a non-physical agent, and they're the eternal author and sustainer of everything we know, all of it. Here it just says the universe. I want to be saying that for simplicity. So the problem of evil is an argument that this God does not exist. So let me go through a bit of my slides. Here's the problem of evil stated in a syllogism, stated in 3 lines. Premise 1, if God exists, then gratuitous evils would not exist or do not exist. Premise 2, gratuitous evils exist. Therefore, it should be conclusion. Therefore, God does not exist. This is the problem. It's very simple. And the problem stated in an evidential form can be thought of like this. existence of what are called gratuitous evils, and I'm going to define gratuitous evils. The existence of that is evidence that disconfirms the existence of a God that I defined earlier. And again, I'm focusing on a God that's called tri-omni. Oh, wow, it's mirrored, so it's a bit confusing. A tri-omni God, again, is all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good. So let me flesh out this argument a bit more. First, I should define what I meant by gratuitous evil. Now, the evidential argument focuses on an evil that can be roughly defined as this. It's an evil that God has no justified good reason to permit. And there are a couple of types of evil that are focused on. There's moral evil, and that's evil that's brought about by free agents, individuals with free wills. So it's our actions, for example, as humans, that create moral evil. An example of this that's everyone's going to know. Think about those who committed the atrocities that make up the Holocaust. They're moral agents. Their actions cause horrendous amounts of pain and suffering for millions and millions of people. That's a moral type of evil. Now, there is natural evil, and this is pain and suffering that's brought about by natural processes. So you can think of people who have died in hurricanes. You can think of people who've died in other natural disasters like earthquakes, etc. But you can also think of this as evil that is just made up of pain and suffering of organisms. Pain and suffering that not just humans go through, but the pain and suffering we see our animal buddies, our buddies in the animal kingdom go through. Now, there is a specific type of evil I'm gonna bring up, but you can, if it bothers people, you can think of it as a part of natural evil. This is called social evil, and this is evil that's evil that arises due to the collective actions of individuals. And I'm going to flesh this out, but you could think of it as a type of natural evils for our purposes. So this problem, the problem of evil against God's existence, it's really best driven home by giving very searing examples. And an example of social evil that can also be an example of a natural evil is a few years ago at a tourist beach in South America. Individuals found, and you can see on the slide in the middle, found an adorable, rare type of a dolphin. And the individuals were so excited to see this dolphin that they all wanted to take selfies. They all took their cell phone and wanted to take pictures with the dolphin, like you're taking a picture with a celebrity. There were so many people at this beach, and they kept on passing this adorable little dolphin around to take pictures of themselves with the dolphin. And the dolphin, because he was away from its family and also out of the water, slowly died. He overheated because dolphins have a lot of insulation, a lot of blubber and stuff, because they live underwater, so they have to adjust to that cool context. But since this dolphin was out of the water for so long, this dolphin slowly died due to heat exhaustion, other problems of that manner. And it was all because people wanted to take pictures of themselves with the dolphin. Now, this is considered a social evil because you have the collective action of these individuals resulting in a horrendous instance of pain and suffering. Now, none of them are evil. None of these people are committing a moral evil. They just wanted to get a cool picture of themselves with a dolphin. It just happens that their collective conduct resulted in this horrendous type of pain and suffering. But evil, natural evil specifically, can just be considered all of the pain and suffering that adorable animals like this baby dolphin have undergone. For millions of years, pain and suffering has occurred. For millions of years, horrendous amounts of evil. Humans, us, animals, etc., have undergone evil that God has no justified good reason to permit. And this has been going on for a long time. So the scale and the duration of the existence of natural evils, that is evil that disconfirms the God of theism. That evil should not exist if God exists. But because that evil does exist, that disconfirms the existence of God. Let me really drive this point home. God is all powerful. God can make a universe with less evil. He can make a universe where, very simply, a universe that is less evil would be one where dolphins just can hang out above water just as well as below water. Evil that has less, a world that has less evil that God can make is a world where humans don't suffer gratuitous amounts of pain when they get hurt, where that dolphin wouldn't go through gratuitous amounts of pain, slowly dying, if it were the case that that it was brought out of its watery environment. So God has the ability to make things such that less evil occurs. God is also all-knowing. God knows that he would make that the world he makes, if he makes it with certain natural laws, if he makes it with certain things like evolution or the existence of animals, etc., he knows that that world, given the laws like our world today, would have so much horrendous pain and suffering. But God, if he knows that, could just make a world without that stuff, without any of it existing. Also, God knows ways to stop, to prevent such evils. God could have just made it so all those tourists, their phones didn't work, and so they couldn't take selfies. So they just put the dolphin back into the water. God knows how to make it so so the river that made it so the dolphin came into contact with the humans would flow another direction. God knows all the different ways to prevent such evils, but it nonetheless occurred. And so again, the existence of such evils disconfirmed God's existence. Finally, look, if we had the power, if we knew the ways to prevent such evils, then we would do so. Given whatever moral, worldview, moral position you hold, many of them are going to conclude with the ability to stop, the ability and the knowledge to stop such an evil, meaning that you should stop such evil. So whatever moral framework that you hold to is going to consider you immoral, for example, if you refuse to prevent, or if you continue if you allow such evil to continue. But if you're not even looking at it from a moral perspective, which is one that I am going to favor, there are justified good reasons to allow or permit amounts of suffering. The fact that I have the ability to stop such suffering, the fact that I know the ways to stop such suffering, would move me to do so, would move me to stop such suffering, or would move me to use my intelligence to prevent such suffering. It's all the more for God. God's all-knowing, all-powerful. It would be reprehensible in many moral frameworks to not stop or to allow even such evils. How am I on time? Okay. So I'm going to briefly mention responses to the problem of evil. I'll just rephrase the issue. There's a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of natural evil, for example. The existence of such evil disconfirms the existence of God. And there have been attempts by theists to address this evil. These attempts are called theodicies. And you can think of them as hypotheses, as explanations. These are explanations that theists give in order to undermine the power of the problem of evil. And I'm just going to list them for now. There's a soul-making theodicy, the greater good theodicy, and the free will theodicy. The soul-making theodicy says that the evils that we see are there in order to make it so our reactions result in, a soul with a lot of quality, a lot of good characters. For example, you wouldn't learn how to be humble if you weren't embarrassed in some way, if you didn't go through that kind of pain and suffering. You wouldn't be able to show that you can persevere through hardship if you didn't go through hardship in the first place. This theodicy says that the God of theism desires individuals with those qualities. And so the evil that we see is there to make it so we have those qualities. Now, the problem with this theodicy is that it doesn't explain the amount and the extended period of pain and suffering that we see in the natural world. Humans didn't arrive until roughly 300 to 200,000 years ago. But for millions and millions of years before that, adorable animals like that dolphin you just saw in the image have gone through agonizing pain and suffering. And we don't know any of those animals. We never saw any of those animals. There's no reason to think that such pain and suffering would add anything to our character. The other thing is you don't need that much extended pain and suffering in order to make it so someone learns humility, in order to make it so someone learns compassion, someone shows that they're empathetic. Just seeing the image, hopefully for everyone in the audience, just seeing that image of that dolphin and realizing and learning that one dolphin, underwent pain and suffering, and all of the qualities, all the character qualities you probably exhibited in response to that image. That's all you need. God didn't need to make it so millions and millions of baby dolphins for millions of years underwent pain and suffering. So the amount of pain and suffering and the fact that much of that pain and suffering occurred well before we even existed makes this theodicy, this attempt to explain evil, rather silly. It makes it so we can dismiss it. Now, there's the greater good theodicy, which says that the evil we see is an evil that's needed for a greater good to emerge. Now, this one is speculative, so I think it's something that I should let my opponent Kyle elaborate on if he holds to this theodicy. But it's one that's also undermined by the points I made earlier. God is all powerful, all knowing, so God has the ability to make it so such evils we see today wouldn't exist. A world with less baby dolphins is a world with less baby dolphins undergoing pain and suffering is going to be a world that God would prefer, given God's goodness, and it's a world that God can make, given He's all powerful and all knowing. Now, another theodicy is the free will theodicy. It says that evil arises due to the actions of free agents, and it also claims that having free will, the ability to choose between A or B, the ability to choose to do or choose to not do evil, is a good. And because of that, you have to have humans with free will, and humans are going to choose and not to choose to do evil, and so that's why we see evil in the world. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. It assumes a very particular type of free will which needs to be defended. It also assumes that free will is something that is good, which is a point that also needs to be defended. But it's largely irrelevant when you look at the examples of gratuitous evil that I've relied on. Right? No free acting agents caused deliberately caused the death of that dolphin. No free acting agents deliberately cause the pain and suffering that we see in the animal kingdom, right? Natural evils are not undercut by anything like the free will theodicy. Now, since I was told earlier that Kyle, and what he said in his introduction, he's really into philosophy of science. I was also told earlier that Kyle's into this idea of theism being an explanation, and it being a better explanation for the existence of evil. But I want to again let him elaborate on that, but undercut some important features. One thing is that if the God hypothesis, if we think of it that way, is supposed to be a good explanation for the evil we see, then it should have qualities of a good explanation. One quality of a good explanation is that it's simple. It relies on few auxiliary or few supplementary explanations for it to work. But if a theist uses God to explain what we see and has to rely on theodicies, all these different theodicies, in order to account for the evil, this theist is relying on a lot of supplementary hypotheses. So it's the case that at the very least, the God hypothesis in the attempt to explain evil is not a good hypothesis because it's full of all these supplementary hypotheses. So that's the problem of evil. There's other issues I want to talk about, but I guess I'm lucky in that the minute is up. And so thank you again for having this debate.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe, for that opening statement. I'm going to have Kyle come in. Kyle, you can go ahead and share your screen, and we'll get you started. And I'm going to go and put Joe in the back. All right.
All right. Can you all see that? All right.
It's good. We're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so about 15 minutes, around 15 minutes, so we'll be good.
Perfect. All right, so first of all, I want to thank Danny for hosting this debate. I appreciated Joe's opening statement. I thought it was pretty well thought out. That's sort of how the problem of evil works, right? Now, today I'm going to present what I call fatal problems for any version of the problem of evil. This includes not just the one that Joe presents, but pretty much any argument from evil that anyone, at least that I'm aware of, that has put on the table. But before we get to there, I want to first sort of lay out how the problem of evil works, right? So this is how it typically works, right? You have the theoretical content of theism, which says that you have a perfect being that is all powerful, all knowing, and all good. And then from this, you say, okay, what theism predicts is that God's goodness would entail that God can only do the best kind of action. And where there is one, right? So I want to clarify that when God does the best kind of action, it must be available for God to do that action, and that there could be no non-best kind of actions, or that there must only be a good state of affairs and no bad states of affairs, right? So that's typically how theism makes its predictions. But of course, this leads to the problem of evil, which is that we do see a bad state, or at least non-best state of affairs. Therefore, theism makes a false prediction, right? And so the idea is that given theism's theoretical content, we have certain data that is difficult to explain on the theistic hypothesis, right? And because allegedly, like, theism is making false predictions, right? However, there's at least 4 reasons I'm going to give for why we should doubt this conclusion. So the first 2 reasons are going to be more defensive, that show that evil is no more likely on naturalism than theism, which means that they're both sort of equal when it comes to explaining the evidence. And then 2 offensive moves, which I will attempt to show that evil is actually more likely on theism than naturalism. So, hopefully we'll go back and forth on the Q&A on there. But anyways, so the first objection I want to bring forth is what I call the myth of a shared axiology. So in order for the problem of evil to get off the ground, it must assume an axiology that will determine the data of good and evil, or determine good or bad states of affairs. Thus, the atheologian must assume a more fundamental value theory that, when compared to theism generates false predictions from. However, this leads to the problem of axiology, which is that there are a plurality of value theories that entail different sets of composable values. You have virtue ethics, utilitarianism, consequentialism, deontology, etc. Right? And so the problem is that God may be constrained by a value theory to increase happiness and reduce suffering. But God may also be constrained by a different value theory, such as virtue ethics, to maximize virtues. Right? So my point here is that in order for the problem of evil to work, you have to assume an axiology. There has to be a shared axiology between the hypotheses. Right? And the value theory, will be part of that background knowledge, right? So that will determine what are the best kinds of state of affairs, and will determine what exactly is the best action for God to take, given his goodness. And so theism would respond to whatever value theory is the case. However, this means that the main discussion should focus on axiology and what exactly is the total set of the distribution of good and evil states. So I guess the general point here is that to judge the value of a word, in order to say that you have this state of affairs that's good or bad, you have to make axiological assumptions, right? And so we must be able to make judgments about which kinds of state of affairs are better than others, and that will require certain value theories that will determine what is good and bad. However, this leads to a problem, which I call the myth of shared axiology. Given such value theory pluralism, disagreements between theists and atheists about which sorts of goods could balance off and justify evils are bound to emerge. The differences in the axiology will determine differences or lead to differences in notions about God's goodness and different evaluations regarding justifiable and unjustifiable evil. And so given this sort of, point here, is that evil cannot really be more likely on naturalism and theism simply because there's going to be more fundamental disagreements about the axiology, right? So that's the first sort of argument. Now, the second sort of defense I want to give is that God is a unique moral agent, right? In the theoretical concept of classical theism, which is a specific view of theism, God is said to be unique in every respect. God is not a human moral person. God is by definition an extraordinary moral person in a unique moral position. This makes it so that there is an aesthetic avenue open to God in a way that does not apply to non-God ethical agents, right? So just some examples. So the first one would be the aesthetic values of cosmic kenosis, which I argued for in on my last video on the problem of evil. And I think a more important consideration is what I call the defeat condition, right? And so on this condition, God is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature. And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a part of a viable, composable whole, and that the goodness of someone's life not only outweighs the evil in that life, but that the goodness that they attain from the defeated evil could not be valuable without that defeated evil, right? And so given that God is a unique moral agent, given that God is constrained by aesthetic constraints and not necessarily moral constraints, at least human moral constraints, then this has consequences for any problem of evil, which is that any argument from inscrutable evils or unnecessary evils or even like pointless evils rely on many ordinary human moral conditions, which I call the necessity condition, that God is not constrained by. And I would also argue that those sort of arguments don't take into account the defeat condition where evil could be part of a larger good enough whole. So again, this is just the idea that God is a unique moral agent and that God is not bound by ordinary human moral conditions, given that God is sort of in a unique moral position, right? Now, the naturalist, of course, can object and insists that minimizing intense and horizon suffering is intrinsically valuable for any agent to pursue. So then God should be motivated to pursue such values. But this makes the mistake of assuming that God is motivated by meta-ethical values and not meta-normative ones. It does not necessarily entail that if an agent perceives that some intrinsic value P, that they ought to pursue P. For it ignores any possibility of an agent having overriding meta-normative motivations to pursue some other intrinsically valuable P, right? And so there are some conditions for making this logical connection. So A, some principal state to relation is good or valuable to all possible agents, right? All possible, not just human agents, but all possible agents. So this includes God, right? 2, there are reasons to pursue P such that there would have to be overriding motivations for any rational and sufficiently informed agent. And in C, for all possible agents, certain actions or attitudes with respect to any other agent amount to either enhancing or diminishing P. And so the point here is that given that God is in a sort of unique moral position, and because he's not part of the moral, at least the human moral arena, then he's going to have different moral constraints, right? And so this is going to be very problematic, right? And so the point here is that there needs to be more work done by the naturalists to show that the theist should not believe that God is interested in defeating evils instead of minimizing evils as much as he can. So in principle, any state of affairs where the evils and suffering are defeatable is the state of affairs that God is justified in authorizing, right? And then, of course, I know that I don't want to necessarily. I'll sort of respond to Joe's point about God could do this or God could do that. Whatever.
Did we lose him? Is it just me? Okay,
Yeah,
we lost Kyle for a
Hey,
second.
well,
I
God
heard
could
with-
do this or could do that in this
Kyle-
different moral situations.
Kyle,
That's
we
what-
lost you. Kyle, we lost
Oh.
you for about a minute. You kind of cut out for a minute.
Okay.
So if you want to rewind the tape, maybe literally 15 seconds, actually.
Oh, okay.
All
Am
right.
I still on the same slide, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we're okay. So I don't know how. Okay, so my point here is that I guess my overall point, at least for this slide, is that more work needs to be done, right, to show that the theists should not believe that God is interested in defeating evils, right? And so just because God has the ability to prevent suffering does not mean that God is necessarily going to be motivated to do that. And so my point here is that there's motivating factors that have to be taken into account, right? And given that God is a unique moral agent, then he's going to have unique motivations to do certain, follow certain moral constraints, right? So that's my second defense. Now, the third, I guess the third argument, and this is more offensive, which is what I call the problem of fine-tuned virtues. If virtues are the highest goods, then there are many virtues that could not exist without initial evils and suffering. Virtues such as courage, compassion, kindness, etc., could not exist without suffering, right? And so with the value constraints in place, then a logically necessary condition for to display the highest virtues entails that there will be evils and suffering of a certain intensity, insofar as they must generate the highest virtues. And so the right way to judge the moral value of a world is how it exemplifies the highest virtues, right? And not by how much suffering exists, right? At least given this sort of axiology, right? With this in mind, then, given the value theory, then God would create a world in which these virtues can grow. And so God must create a world by which there is a high probability that the maximum number of people will display or achieve and display virtues. If this is true, however, then there will be a narrow range by which the highest virtues could be properly exemplified, achieved, and displayed, right? And so this will lead to my, I guess, first argument. So I guess before I get to the argument, I just want to talk about the relevant data here. So the data is since the very beginning of earthly existence, right? So this includes not just humans, but any sort of life on Earth. Suffering has come with a frequency and intensity which falls into a relatively narrow, fine-tuned range world ensemble that is enough to magnitude and foster saints, but not enough as to overwhelm people to make evil not worth it, right? And again, I'll get more into this in our discussion, but that's just the relevant data, right? And so this leads to my, I guess, first argument against naturalism here, at least from evil. Premise 1, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Premise 2, if God is all-good, then he would only create the best kind of worlds. Premise 3, if God is all-powerful, nothing could prevent God from acting on his goodness to bring about the best goods. Therefore, nothing could prevent God from creating the best or creating worlds with the best kinds of goods, right? Now, premise 5, I think, is the most crucial here, which is that the best kinds of goods are the authentic display of apec and kenosis love manifested virtues. Premise 6, therefore, God will bring about a world fostering the authentic display of apec and kenosis love manifested virtues. Premise 7, the authentic display of apec and kenosis love manifested virtues, or creation and creatures having ultimate responsibility and growing virtues, logically entails the incurrence of a very significant bad state of affairs, or EH, which is the data, right? Premise 8, therefore, God will bring about a world described in EH. If 8, then theism strongly predicts EH. Theism, strongly predicts EH. However, I would argue that naturalism does not predict EH, right? And I'll get more into that in the next slide. And in 12, EH, or the data, favors theism against naturalism, right? And so the whole point of this argument is to show that there is a fine-tuned intensity and frequency of suffering that is evidence for theism, right? And of course, this leads to my next, I guess, final sort of point, right? Which is that for theism, there is a good-to-good mapping from God's nature to a state of affairs, such that a good state of affairs is more likely than a bad state of affairs. However, this leads to the conclusion that any sort of good state of affairs would be evidence for theism. Now, I just want to also clarify here that this is when the theist would present a theodicy, right? And so, given a theodicy, theism imposes some limitations of the upper and lower bounds of the distribution of good and evil, and so provides an explanatory account of the good and evil. However, naturalism does not provide this explanatory account, right? For naturalism, when you compare this sort of with naturalism, for naturalism, there is no good-to-good mapping from an indifferent universe to a state of affairs, since there is no mechanism to sort out value outcomes. This leads to the conclusion that there is no set of good or bad states of affairs that can ever be evidence for naturalism, right? And so the only way for, I think, the problem of evil to actually work is that you have to say, or you have to argue that theism makes false predictions, right? And so this is sort of like how Paul Draper sort of approaches it, right? So the whole point is like, even if naturalism may not exactly predict the data of evil, theism predicts the opposite. It makes a false prediction, right? And so, from there you could sort of argue, okay, well, even if naturalism does not exactly predict evil, it's at least more epistemically friendly towards a sort of naturalistic hypothesis, right? However, this leads what I would argue for a problem for naturalism, which is that the moment that theism uses a theodicy to explain the distribution of good and evil, naturalism is at a disadvantage, since it has no value mapping mechanism to explain the data of evil, whereas theism, with the theodicy, is actually laying the groundwork for such a mapping mechanism to be possible, right? I don't know how much time I have left, but if I have a few moments,
You got about a minute or two. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So my general point here is that in order for the problem of evil to actually work, right, in order to actually, like, at least Draper's sort of approach, in order for it to work, you have to show that theism makes false predictions, right? And I think there's many different reasons to think that's not the case. I presented two main reasons in the beginning, and then, you have these sort of considerations to take into account. And so given problems 1 and 2, given the myth of pseudo-axiology, and given that God is a unique moral agent, then I would argue that evil can be explained equally as well on theism when compared to naturalism without a theodicy. So I don't even think you really need a theodicy to actually solve the problem of evil. I think what a theodicy does is it actually gives theism the advantage, at least when it comes to explaining evil, right? And so this, given problems 3 and 4, I would argue that theism can be explained better on theism when compared to naturalism with a theodicy. So again, you will need a theodicy when it comes to, like, if you want to actually, like, give theism the advantage when it comes to evil. But I actually, at least to solve the problem of evil, right, I don't think you really necessarily need a theodicy. So, and then of course there's other considerations about whether or not a theodicy is an auxiliary hypothesis. I would argue it's not. We can go back and forth in discussion there. So yeah, that's my general point. And of course, points of contention, which we'll get into in the discussion, which is 1, the pseudo-axiology, 2, God is a unique moral agent. Hopefully Joe and I can go back and forth on the defeat condition. Number 3, it's sort of fine-tuning argument. So, you have the intensity and frequency of suffering being evidence for theism. And then, of course, the 4th point, which is that theodicies sort of provide an explanatory advantage to theism against naturalism. So that'll be I'll stop there.
All right. Now Joe is back on, so I didn't warn him. But yeah, thanks for your opening statement there, Kyle. What we're going to proceed to is about 45 minutes of discussion, or we're going to kind of hand it to Joe in terms of starting out the cross-examination / discussion. But it's kind of free flow. I know I've talked to both of you all many times, or I've talked to Joe many times. I've talked to Kyle once or twice, and so I know y'all are really chill, so I can kind of put the Tesla autopilot on thing here. So, Joe, you can kick off the cross-examination, and then we'll kind of proceed.
Sure. You can hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
So I have a been in a debate in a while, so I thought that I would not have enough material for my opening, but I felt like I ran out of time. I didn't have a nice conclusion. Kyle, it sounds like you're the same, so I'm looking forward to like fleshing out more concepts in this part. I'm gonna ask some clarifying questions, and then we'll probably get into more heavy back and forth. I wasn't sure I defined a couple of things, and since I didn't see any specific definitions in your presentation, is it safe to assume you're fine with my definition of God?
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally, yeah, I'm fine with
Right.
that.
And you're fine with my definition of gratuitous evil too?
Yeah, it depends on like what moral conditions you're using. So I would say, okay, so one of the things that I sort of pointed out in my opening statement was that there's two sort of, I think a lot of these discussions are talking past each other, right? So you have the necessity condition, which I didn't really clarify that, so I guess I should probably clarify that now, which is that on the necessity condition, evil is only authorized, or God is only allowed to permit evils if it is necessary to bring about a greater good, right? And so that's where the greater good theodicy comes in. Now, as a theist, I don't accept that condition, right? So I have a different axiology than what the atheologian presents there, right? And so on my condition, on my sort of value theory, God is authorized to allow evil as long as they are defeated, right? So that sort of changed the game, because on that sort of account, then God is allowed to permit unnecessary suffering or even pointless suffering, but as long as that suffering can be defeated, then God is authorized to allow it, right? So there is a sort of there is a higher bar that the atheist is going to have to reach, at least on that condition, than the necessity condition. So yeah.
Okay. So I guess we can unpack that a little bit. But you brought up something that's important. Throughout your presentation, you compared and contrast the theism to naturalism, and you also mentioned Paul Draper, and he's a naturalist. But Paul Draper also brings up this idea called the hypothesis of indifference. And Danny, can I show my slide again? I have this definition on the slide. The hypothesis of indifference is neither nature nor the condition of sentient beings on Earth is the result of a good or an evil action by God. So I wanted to make clear just now you brought up atheism, and as an atheist, I am working with this position. I don't feel like I'm committed to naturalism. So your comparisons to naturalism are unfounded. So this question is this question has like two angles. Do you think there's a reason why the atheist is committed to naturalism? And how the other part of this question is, how does your presentation handle this stance, the hypothesis of indifference?
Well, I think in my presentation, let me see if I can. So I did compare. So when I meant by naturalism is I mentioned for naturalism, there is no good mapping from an indifferent universe, right? So that's where the hypothesis of indifference. So I do think that naturalism, built in with the hypothesis of indifference, that's what I'm comparing with. So I don't know what your criticism is. I mean,
the criticism is I'm not a naturalist. I'm an atheist, but I'm not a naturalist. And as an atheist, I feel like I would only really need to commit to this hypothesis. And if you commit to this hypothesis, this for one thing that is rendered irrelevant is this idea of like your moral position having a huge impact on what you could say about the problem of evil. This doesn't commit me to any moral position when I say there's a problem of evil. Instead, when I'm saying there's a problem of evil, I'm saying there exists a God with certain attributes. We would expect to see things given that God's existence. We would not expect to see things given that God's existence. We wouldn't expect to see all the gratuitous amounts of pain and suffering. So the fact that we do see that disconfirms the God's existence. I don't have to make any moral I don't have to argue for any moral framework in order to lay out that problem.
Yeah, so I agree with you. So one of the things with the problem of evil, as I mentioned, this is why I mentioned the problem of evil, how it works, right? So you start off with your theoretical content, right? And then, but the problem there is I see that what the atheist is doing is that they're using axiology that a theist does not have to accept, right? So I agree with you that you as an atheist personally, you don't have to hold a moral position. It's sort of like an internal critique, right? Of the position.
It's one way. Yeah, you're right. You go ahead. I want to hear what you're
So
saying.
my point here is that with an axiology of the defeat condition, that God is a unique world agent, that God has metanormative sort of obligations, or I would not just obligations, but also metanormative aesthetic motivations to do certain actions, right? Then I don't think you can use a problem of evil there, because on that sort of account, God is not constrained by the necessity condition, right? So God is not going to be motivated on that account, on that axiology, on that theistic axiology, to prevent suffering as much as possible, right? Because God is not conditioned by that condition, right? God is conditioned by the defeat condition, right? And so on that sort of account, you're not going to be able to really present any sort of argument from unnecessary suffering or pointless suffering, right? Or even inscrutable suffering, because it's using the wrong axiology. It's using the axiology that a theist is not committed to, right? And so I think what's important here is that I think when someone if an atheologian presents the problem of evil, what they need to do is they need to ask the theist, right? Okay, what's your axiology? Like, what are the moral conditions that God is constrained by? And then if those moral conditions is the necessity condition, or maybe if a theist thinks that like God is a human, like God is constrained by ordinary human moral conditions, then then yeah, you could present a problem of evil there. But the problem is that if a theist doesn't accept that axiology, then the problem of evil is not going to even get off the ground, is what I'm saying.
So it sounds like this is what I'm hearing. You're saying that there's a moral framework that not only theists hold to, but there's one that we don't have access to that God holds to. And given that they're beholden to that moral framework, the problem that's offered by atheists is irrelevant. It's not a problem given the aims, goals, and desires
it's a
of theists in that framework. Well, hold on.
Yeah, go
but
ahead.
I think that one way to kind of so this is like a heavier, I think, almost irrelevant to the point at hand problem that you're bringing up. I could just point to examples and ask you questions, and in that way we can demonstrate the problem of evil. Like, for example, if you had the ability to stop the cell phones of all those people who were taking selfies with the dolphin, if you had the ability to stop their cell phones, and you knew that doing that would make it so that dolphin wouldn't be picked up and passed around, would you do that? Would you stop? Would you turn off those people's cell phones?
Well, yeah, because I'm constrained by human moral conditions, ordinary human moral conditions, right? So I would stop that. What I'm saying is that God is not constrained by that.
What's the reason why God wouldn't stop it?
Because God is in a unique moral position, right?
What is that unique moral position?
The unique moral position is that given that God sort of sees the larger picture, given that God can sort of guarantee the defeat of evils in that circumstance, right? Then God is authorized to allow it, given that God is not a human moral person, given that God, he's not only is he not a human moral person, but God is not constrained by ordinary human moral conditions, right? And so I think the problem, at least the problem with the problem of evil, is that it assumes that God is an ordinary human moral person, right? And as a theist, I'm not committed to that.
What is the moral position that God's committed to that makes it so the amounts of pain and suffering that we see in the world not only have occurred, but seem to be perpetuated?
Well, I'd say I think one of the core moral conditions, right? There might be others out there. I think one of the core ones is that God is constrained by the defeat condition, where God cannot allow an indefeasible evil. So basically, an evil that cannot be defeated, within the total existence of any creature, right? So I would say that God is sort of obligated to make sure that all creatures can defeat their evils, right? And that those evils that are defeated, that they can be part of a larger, greater whole, right? So it's not just about like if God has the ability to stop evil and present it, but rather if God has the sort of obligation to make sure that all creatures can sort of defeat their evil, right? Given that God sort of sees the whole picture, right? Now, of course, I do admit that that sort of moral condition definitely raises the bar, right? Because then in that case, you're going to have to show that there are indefeasible evils. And I would say if you could show that there are indefeasible evils, then I would say that is disconfirming evidence against theism, right? But the problem that I see here is that what the atheist is doing, I mean, not just you, but like, anyone I have conversation about this, is they're assuming what's called the necessity condition, right? And the problem is that the necessity condition is not, that only applies to human beings given our limited context, whereas for God, it wouldn't apply to him. He has different sort of more holistic constraints, right? Moral constraints.
Right. So maybe I could just frame it this way then. It is a world where there's one less dolphin dying, in the example I gave, a better world because it has less evil than the world that we exist in?
So better in one context, it is better in the context of ordinary human moral conditions. Right now, they're actually speaking of whether or not we live in the best kind of world. So there is a paper called "God Meets Satan Apple," which is the paradox of creation. The author, I think, is named Rubio. I think that's his first. Daniel Rubio or something like that. So I didn't mention this in the opening statement because I thought it would be too long. But one of the things about the paper that he presents is that he goes over like a lot of these scenarios where God can always just create the best. Like any world that God creates, there's always a better one, right? And so it just keeps going and going and going, right? And so the problem is you run into a lot of paradoxes where God cannot create any world at all, right? Given that there's always a better world that God could create, right? And so what he concludes, there's sort of two ways out of the paradox. One is you say that you sort of go Swinburne's route where you say that God sort of has more freedom. So God doesn't necessarily, because given that there's an infinite amount of options for God to choose from, right? Then God just sort of chooses one. Or you can go with the condition, which is what I hold to, which is also what I think, what's her name? Marilyn McCord Adams, she holds this view as well, which is that God is just not constrained by ordinary human moral conditions, right? That God sort of, well, she doesn't argue this directly, but I know John Snyder, he wrote a book on the Darwinian problem. And one of his points is that God is sort of constrained by aesthetic values, right? And so what that means is that there's sort of more freedom. There's more a variety of worlds that God can create, right? Given that sort of moral framework, right? Or it's not even a moral framework; it's more like an aesthetic, metanormative framework. So if we're talking meta ethics, there is a difference between meta ethics and metanormative ethics, but I don't want to get too much into that. But basically, my overall point is that given the paradox of creation, then God is not going to necessarily, like, when the best kind of world is not going to be like, it's not going to be ordinary human moral conditions. Or at least it's not going to be judged by that. It's going to be judged by these sort of more aesthetic constraints, right? And so given that that is sort of like the well, I would argue it's an entailment of theism, but also you could also sort of build it into the theoretical content of theism, that given that God is constrained by these aesthetic conditions, these metanormative conditions, then there's more freedom for God to allow these certain evils to occur, right? Even if it's unnecessary to obtain a greater good, God is still God is still allowed to permit them as long as they are defeated. So again, as long as the evil can be defeated, it's not really going to be a problem for God to pursue.
How could something be unnecessary but also be defeated in the sense that you're talking about?
Right. So okay. So this is actually a classic example where you have a burning fountain. I think William Rowe presents this sort of argument where you have you have a burning fountain in the forest, right? And so in that sort of case, there's nothing.
William Rowe. Okay, yeah, the burning doe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and
the example I'll give it. There's a forest fire and a baby deer like Bambi dies slow, horrendous cooking death. And this happened. There's no immediate like
Greater
we can't
good.
think of reasons why that would contribute to a good, right?
Right.
So the problem is that if you're claiming, if the problem I'm pointing out is a bit different, if you're agreeing that something is an unnecessary evil, then how can you say that that is an evil that's going to give rise to a greater good? If it's an unnecessary evil, you're saying that it's an evil that wouldn't give rise to a greater good.
Right. So my point is that it is an unnecessary evil, but that it's a defeatable evil, which means that evil can be defeated within the total life, the total existence of that creature. Right.
How could you say that about like not just Bambi dying in a burning like thicket, but the countless Bambis that have died in forest fires for the like intense amount, the large volume, the duration of pain and suffering that we see everywhere? How is that like, what are God's reasons for allowing that evil? What's the, I guess, defeat condition, if you will?
Well, one of the core, I guess, reasons is that it allows creatures to reflect on that, right? When they sort of go, because I sort of hold to a view that animals were sort of go into purgatory, or at least a purgatorial state, right? So that in that case, it's not like the faun dies or the animals died and then they just they go out of existence, right? I would say that this is something that Trent Dowdy also sort of argues, where there is a sort of purgatorial state by which they can understand the suffering they go through, right? And so even if not in that immediate instance there is no greater good, I would say overall, as long they can defeat that evil, right? So the point is not that it's unnecessary, right? Because I can grant that. The point is that it's still defeatable, so God is still permitted to allow it, right? No matter how much suffering there is, as long as the evil is defeatable, then God is allowed to permit it. So it doesn't matter how much evil there actually is, as long as it's defeatable, then that's sort of like, that's sort of like the boundary that God is allowed to pursue, right? And again, I do admit that this defeat condition, allows for a much wider range of evil. So it's not as narrow as we initially thought. I can sort of agree to that sort of point, right? But my overall point is that there's still a boundary that God is constrained by. There's still a boundary. There's still sort of like a narrow range that God is permitted to allow this sort of evil, even if it's like much wider than the initial boundary. I hope that makes sense.
So I want to focus on the example again, and I want to focus on this idea of comparing and contrasting hypotheses as well. Like there's the God hypothesis, which is an attempt to explain pain and suffering, and then there's the hypothesis of indifference. Now, on the hypothesis of indifference, what would explain why so many animals undergo pain and suffering would be things like, well, evolution. Would be things like, for example, with Bambi, forest fires occur. There's natural forest fires that arise all the time. Now, that's the explanation that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference. It's consistent with atheism. But what it sounds like you're saying is the explanation that the theist is committed to explain those types of evil is that dawn dies but goes to a purgatory, and in that purgatory, like some greater good is obtained?
Well, so let me clarify. So my response to that was more defensive. So I wasn't necessarily given a full theodicy on that example. I was just, defending the point that this is not just confirming evidence, right? So even if so my point here is like, given the burning fawn, given the intense amount of suffering, we would no more likely expect this on theism than naturalism, right? Now, of course,
Hold on. Which would you say is more likely, that there's natural disasters like forest fires that cause such pain and suffering, or that fawn needed to go to purgatory and obtain some greater good? Which hypothesis would you say?
So
which explanation would you say is more likely?
So here, okay, this maybe I'm not seeing it the same way you are. So you had to have positive indifference, right? Where there's just the universe doesn't care, right? So it just happens, right? Okay, that's fine. My defensive move is that evil that occurred is still that's still defeatable evil, right? So because it's still defeatable evil, and if God is permitted to allow defeatable evil, right, then it's no more likely expected that this would occur, right? Now, of course, that's just
you're saying the defeatable evil, though. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're saying the defeatable evil, to clarify, and I'll let you continue, is that there's a purgatory that animals go to where greater good is obtained.
Right. So
given it sounds like that's the explanation on theism for that instance of pain and suffering. Would you say that explanation is more likely than the explanation that's consistent with atheism, which is that wildfires will result in animals in a given forest dying?
Right. So here's the consideration I think is important here. So I wasn't necessarily giving a full-blown theodicy, at least for that example. What I was trying to do is trying to show a defensive move where it's no more likely. So I wouldn't, again, just on the defeat condition alone, the defeat condition alone is only meant to neutralize the disconfirming evidence. It's not meant to actually give the advantage to theism. Now, I can give the advantage to theism if I present a theodicy, right, where I can explain more, but I'm not necessarily going to do that here. I'm just saying that if God is constrained by a defeat condition, and if these are defeatable evils, and if God, and if from that, if God is authorized in allowing those defeatable evils, then it's no more likely expected that this would occur, right? On either hypothesis.
When you claim it's no more likely expected to occur on either hypothesis, that's you telling me you have an answer to the question I asked, which is more likely, which better explains the pain and suffering of Bambi dying in that thicket in the middle of the forest. Is it that wildfires will cause animals in a given forest to die? Or is it that Bambi needed to go to some animal purgatory and in order to obtain in order to meet some goodness condition?
So here's the thing.
I want to make sure you understand, when you say that that there's a higher likelihood on theism given a this defeat condition.
I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying.
You're saying it evens the playing field.
It does, yeah. That's
what
I would.
Even when you say that, though, the issue with the problem of evil is showing that that theism doesn't theism doesn't account for the evil, and so it's disconfirmed by the amounts of evil. You merely saying that there's a level playing field. I'm asking for more. I'm asking you to show that it's not that theism is not disconfirmed by the amounts of evil. When I ask that question specifically, that's all I'm asking. But you repeating, well, I'm leveling the playing field. You're not answering the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So one of the problems, so in order to actually show that this is disconfirming evidence, you're going to have to assume the axiology that I'm using, right? You have to assume the theistic axiology in order to show that theism is making false predictions.
That's the thing. I used your example, the purgatory that a deer goes to. That's assuming the axiology. that's assuming the theistic the theistic account, right? And so I'm asking, given that assumption, which do you think is more likely? And I'll tell you what I think, to spoil it. I think that it's more likely explained by these natural conditions. Wildfires occur. Wildfires have a tendency to destroy the animals living in where those wildfires occur. I think that is a much better explanation compared to the one that you described.
So I guess just one. I don't know how much time we have left, but one
Kyle,
question.
I'm going to let you respond to that, Kyle. So Kyle's going to respond to Joe, and then I'm just letting you know we're about halfway through. So Kyle, if you want to kind of respond to Joe, and then maybe we could shift to the cross examination more coming from your direction.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So I guess one clarifying question: Are you talking about this specific example of fawns, or just general bad states of affairs?
I give the example, and I'm focusing on this because it's the it appears to be the one thing that you're giving an example where theism better explains the evidence, better explains the data. The data, for example, is this is Bambi dying in a thicket, a burning thicket. We can talk about that, but this is where the problem is just becomes undaunting for the theist. It's all the more for the countless examples of animals dying in the forest. The more that you claim, oh, it's because there's an animal purgatory that they go to where this goodness condition is obtained, the more incredulous I feel to this idea that that's a better explanation than pointing to the natural processes that cause forest fires.
Right. So two general, I guess, responses. So the first one is that the theistic hypothesis is not meant to explain specific facts, right? So like one of the examples in the philosophy of science is like when we ask, okay, well, why do apples fall? Okay, well, that's not really relevant. What's the real question is, why do things with mass attract, right? So there's this more, I guess for me, I'm looking at it as a more, why do bad states of affairs occur? That's a more interesting question to me than why do fawns die unnecessary deaths, right?
I mean, if you're fine with this idea that we're just looking at this broader concept, right? Not looking at the apple, we're looking at what makes sense in light of laws about mass. Fine. What explains why we would see the horrendous amounts of pain and suffering in the world? And when the thing is, when I asked for that that explanation on theism, you gave this idea that there's some sort of purgatory that that creatures go to where this goodness condition is obtained. Now I'm asking you, why is
no,
that
what I'm
more
saying
like?
is that what I'm saying is that the defeat condition is obtained, right? That's just an entailment of the hypothesis of theism. Right?
How is that when the fact that you're not answering this tells me that to me is the defeat condition not being obtained, right? How is that? And the idea is that if the defeat condition is obtained, then theism is a better explanation than something like the hypothesis of indifference.
I'm not saying that. So
It's
I would
a level
argue,
playing field.
yes. So what I'd say is
I'm asking for more though.
right. So what? Okay. So what? How is that? How is naturalism a better explanation on that sort of account? So we have the indifferent universe, right, and we have the defeat condition. Again, I'm not presenting a theodicy. The defeat condition is just a condition, right? It's just meant to neutralize the evidence, level the playing field, so to speak, right? So where is naturalism getting the advantage from?
They can well, again, I'm not committed to naturalism.
Because, well, okay, so my point here is that in order for naturalism to actually have the advantage, you have to show that theism is making a false prediction. My response to that was that given the defeat condition, that theism is not making a false prediction in this scenario. So I don't know
How can you make that claim?
naturalism
How is that? You're saying that we can you're saying that we can confirm or disconfirm for example, the animal purgatory? purgatory. Excuse me.
No, how should I say this? So my point here is that in order for naturalism to have the advantage, theism has to make false predictions.
Yeah, how
Right.
can we falsify that prediction? We would expect to see these animals go into purgatory,
Well, yeah, but
where
you're
the
making
goodness condition
you're also making an undefended assumption. You're assuming the necessity condition, right? You're assuming the axiology, right?
Is that a falsifiable
It's the assumption we
explanation?
have to make in order for the problem evil to work. You have to make that assumption. You have to assume the necessity condition, right? So what I'm doing is I'm rejecting that necessity condition. I'm bringing in my own undefended assumptions, right, to show that given this defeat condition, it's going to neutralize the evidence, right?
You said the point is that you have to show that they're false predictions. One of the predictions you gave, I'm asking you, how do you show that it's false?
Right. So how you show it's false is that there are indefeasible evils, right? So given the defeat condition, if God can only authorize, defeatable evils, then there can be no indefeasible evils. And so you would have to show that there are actually indefeasible evils, right?
Right.
Given that condition, right? It's the filter. The condition is the filter by which you can make, positive or negative predictions from.
Okay.
Right.
So the gratuitous amounts of pain and suffering in the animal kingdom. What's the explanation for that? What's the non-defeasible condition on theism?
No, so this is an undefended assumption, right? Where it's the defeat condition, right? Where God is obligated to make sure that all evil is defeated. It's not the necessity condition. So I'm not going by the atheologian view that God must prevent all unnecessary suffering, right? I reject that condition. What I hold to is the defeat condition, where God cannot allow for indefeasible evils. And my point here is that there is no examples of indefeasible evils, right? And so given that, then that basically neutralizes the playing field, right?
Why is the horrendous amount of pain and suffering in the animal kingdom not an example of indefeasible evil?
Because it's an entailment of the hypothesis of theism that there is going to be an afterlife, that there's going to be a world by which these creatures can defeat their evils, right?
How would you falsify that? How would you falsify that?
You don't. Well, in that case, I mean, it's just an entailment of the hypothesis, right?
How would you falsify that?
I don't need to falsify it. It's part of the explanation.
You're claiming that it has that. I would have to show that it's a false prediction. If why, if it's an entailment of the hypothesis that you can't falsify, that's a problem for the hypothesis.
Well, okay, in that sense, are you saying that theism is unfalsifiable?
No, the claim that there's an afterlife, and that explains the horrendous amounts of pain and suffering in the animal kingdom. That it sounds to me like you're saying you can't falsify that. The other thing is, how is that a more likely explanation for all the pain and suffering we see?
I'm not saying it's more likely. What I'm saying is that it's not as surprising. Like, it's not surprising in any theory. Now, of course, I could, and I don't. Danny, do you want me to start?
Yeah. So we're gonna kind of then shift. Let's just kind of shift. He's been kind of doing the cross examination from his point of view. So Joe, we're gonna go ahead and kind of shift from you asking questions to him asking questions.
Okay.
And kind of dropping the line of argument that we were just y'all were just discussing. So you can go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah. So I guess one of my first things is so do you sort of agree that the theist, or at least I guess not the theist, but the atheist should be using the theistic axiology in order to actually generate this problem evil?
No, I think you can use the understanding of God that I'm pointing to. You don't have to appeal to any type of framework. It just so happens that given the axiology that it sounds like you agree to, I don't think that theism explains the evil. So I think that it's disconfirmed by the evil.
Right. So can you give me an example of an indefeasible evil within a theistic context?
Well, it sounds like if you're saying that theism better explains the evil, right? And then your explanation entails this idea that there's an animal afterlife. All I have to do is just show that explanation pales in comparison to any explanation that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference. One explanation any explanation that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference. One explanation that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference is that there are natural wildfires that occur in the world. Those will cause horrendous amounts of pain and suffering. That explanation is more likely compared to this explanation that there's an animal afterlife. And the fact that that's more likely means that we should prefer that explanation over the theistic explanation. And so that's all I feel I have to do.
Right. So why is it more likely? Is it just because it has less commitment? Are you going the Paul Draper route here, or?
Well, there's a couple more. You could point to explanatory virtues, for example. Given our background knowledge, it seems more likely. We have background experience with wildfires causing animals to undergo horrendous amounts of suffering. What's the other thing is it sounded like you agreed that the explanation given that there's an afterlife is you can't falsify it, right? We should prefer hypotheses that fit with our background experience. We should prefer hypotheses that are falsifiable. The theistic explanation doesn't fit with our background experience. It's not falsifiable, and you agreed with that. So we shouldn't prefer the theistic explanation.
So what I said, I guess, I don't want to. I'll just briefly respond to that. So my response to that was that purgatory was an entailment of the hypothesis. Right now, what you could do, you could say that you could say, okay, well, theism as a hypothesis is unfalsifiable, right? And I would push back against that. I would say, no, it is falsifiable if you can show that theism makes false predictions, right? And my point here is that I'm not really sure where the false predictions are generated, because in order to generate the false predictions, you're going to have to assume an axiology, right? And so my point here is that given the sort of axiology that I work with, I'm not really sure where the false predictions are emerging from, right?
You're asking me is that the question?
Yeah. So I guess that's just my response. And then I don't want to, I guess I should just ask you the questions. But so my question is, if it's an entailment of the hypothesis of theism that you're going to have an afterlife, how, like, in that sort of scenario, the probability of there being an afterlife is equally likely as theism itself. And so where exactly is naturalism having the advantage? Is it on simplicity? Is it because just because a hypothesis doesn't entail, just because a hypothesis entails certain things, that doesn't make it less likely, right? It's just a logical entailment from the hypothesis, right? So where exactly is your argument that naturalism is less likely, or sorry, that naturalism is more likely when compared to theism? Like where does that come in?
Well, I don't understand how it's undermined this idea that it's not simple if one of the necessary entailments is something that you can't falsify. If something's could be readily confirmed or disconfirmed, readily falsifiable, and it assumes the fewest amounts of auxiliary hypotheses, then it's not. Then it's the most simple explanation. Now, if we put that in the terms that you've been using, the idea that there's this necessary entailment of the afterlife, that's still like something. If we explore it, that's unfalsifiable, and it's also still an auxiliary hypothesis added on to theism, making it not simple.
So would you say that an entailment is an auxiliary hypothesis?
I just said that.
So you would say that it is, right?
Right. It's something. yeah, how can you, especially if we're thinking about probability, the way to think about this extra part of the theistic hypothesis is to say it's an auxiliary hypothesis to the theistic hypothesis.
Okay, so would you agree that the indifferent universe hypothesis entails that there is going to be an overall more tragedy than there's going to be overall more tragedy on a sort of indifferent universe than there is triumph? Would you agree to that?
Tragedy over triumph?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by those terms.
Like overall, there's going to be more not bad states of affairs, but like overall in the total existence of creatures, there's going to be more tragedy and more, basically like bad endings for creatures than good endings for creatures.
Well, all I feel like I'm committed to saying is that there are accounts of the world which would lead to more pain and suffering. Is that another way of putting what you said?
Right. So
there are
my
accounts of the world that would lead to that are consistent with the hypothesis of indifference, but I don't feel like I'm necessarily committed to that.
Right. So my concern here is that I think indifference would actually entail that there's going to be overall more tragedy than triumph, right? But the entailment that there's more tragedy and triumph, that's not a falsifiable hypothesis. That's an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
The thing is that I don't feel like I've ever committed myself to that position. So you saying that that's a position I'm beholden to hasn't been argued.
Okay, so would you be agnostic on the question if there's more tragedy than triumph on the indifference view?
I'm saying that on the indifference view, you can be committed. That's a view that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference, but it's not a view that you're committed to if you hold to the hypothesis of indifference over theism.
Right. So do you think that there's any entailments from the hypothesis of indifference?
Yeah, I think that we would expect to see how our accounts of of natural processes to better explain our observations. One account of a natural hypothesis is that there are wildfires. Wildfires tend to deplete the animals living in the forests that undergo them. So we would expect to see something like Bambi dying in a wildfire. That's a position that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference. And I think that that's a better explanation for why we see not just Bambi dying in a wildfire, for why we see all the pain and suffering of animals in the world, why it's occurred for millions of years.
Right. So if that's an entailment, could you, given that example, right, couldn't you extend that towards just the overall life on Earth? That the universe is going to go through a heat death. That's an entailment of the hypothesis. So given the heat death of the universe on an indifferent world, on an indifference hypothesis, then your overall, at least the entailment from that, is that you're going to have more tragedy and triumph, right? And so that would be the entailment of the hypothesis of indifference, right? But the problem is that entailment is unfalsifiable, right? That's going to happen in the future. It's not something we could actually know about now, right?
So here's how this is the thing. A prediction is that we would expect to see planets close to a star like ours would eventually undergo this heat death, right? You're saying that's a prediction that's unfalsifiable?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that given the total existence, given the future, right? Given that this is going to happen supposedly in the future, right? At least on the indifference view, then that's that scenario is unfalsifiable.
Right? I don't wonder, like the idea that our planet can burn up and as a consequence to its distance from the sun is unfalsifiable.
Yeah,
but the thing is, all you have to do to falsify that is to show in the universe, another planet next to a star, same distance, that doesn't undergo such a heat death. That would falsify it.
Right, but the falsification there would start off with the theoretical content, not with the entailment, right?
The thing is if it's a prediction that's being made, right? It just sounds like you agreed that it can be falsifiable. Why? Because it's
So the reason why it's falsifiable is because the way that you generate the prediction is from the hypothesis, right? So what I'm saying is that it's the same thing with theism, right? So I would say that theism is falsifiable if you can show that there are indefeasible evils, right? So my point here is that there seems to be a symmetry between an afterlife being unfalsifiable versus an indifferent universe is future being unfalsifiable. My only point here is, I mean, wouldn't you agree at least that like the entailment is not what really matters in the hypothesis, but rather what should matter is the theory itself and not necessarily its consequences?
So when you say entailment, I'm thinking of the predictions that's being made. I think that that's one of the key parts of an explanation is that it makes predictions. So you can evaluate the merits of that explanation. The fact that you can evaluate the merits of an explanation consistent with a hypothesis of indifference, you can evaluate the heat death of the universe, you can make predictions about it, is something that makes it so hypotheses consistent with the hypothesis of indifference are a better hypotheses compared to the God hypotheses, especially if the God hypotheses makes predictions about the goodness obtaining in an afterlife, and that prediction you can't falsify.
Right, but wouldn't you agree that you can't falsify that the universe is going to go through a heat death?
No, not at all. I gave an example of how you could falsify it.
Right, but it's not the falsification there is not from the entailment, it's from the theory. That's my point.
No, there's
So
a prediction. You could show that you could false. Let me think of a way of putting this. You're saying that the theory is being falsified in the explanation I gave by showing that the prediction, but I don't understand. I'm not sure what are predictions that could be made that you can demonstrate to be false. Earlier you said that there's a problem, and this problem you haggle over whether or not theism makes false predictions, right?
right.
So when you say false predictions, I thought that you meant these are predictions that are that don't come true, right? And the thing is that I haven't heard any prediction from theism that we can evaluate as coming true or not coming true. Now you said that the hypothesis of indifference, you think that one entailment is the heat death of the universe, but that's a prediction of a hypothesis that's consistent with the hypothesis of indifference.
Right.
And the thing is that I think that you could show that prediction to be false. And the example I gave is you could find a star that has a planet at the same distance as their own planet, and you can observe it. And if you see that it doesn't undergo a heat death the same way that our planet would go, that would show that the prediction that would falsify the prediction, right? We would expect to see that occur given the relationship between the star and the planet. We don't see that. That just confirms it. But this isn't shown at all on theism.
Right. So Kyle, if you want to respond to that, and then we can. I don't know if you had any more questions in mind for Joe.
No, if fine.
You did, okay. So if you, because we do have a couple more minutes for you if you wanted it, but did you want to respond to that? And after your response, we can go ahead and go to some of the questions that the chat had asked.
Yeah. So just one clarifying question. This will require me to share my screen. Hold on, because I just want to make sure that me and Joe are overall agreeing to the same point here. Okay, so Joe, would you agree with this this characterization of the problem of evil? Joe.
Yeah, I'm reading it.
Yeah. Do you? So my point, I guess my final question for you is: do you agree this is how you falsify theism?
But
So that
look,
because that's what I mean by false prediction.
this
Basically, that
sure. Let me
Yeah.
read it. So the thing is that if we are comparing the theistic hypothesis, I'm fine with that being this with this idea, because I'm claiming that theism is disconfirmed by this amount of evil. I don't agree. Well, yeah, I'm agreeing that it can't be disconfirmed, so I'm agreeing it could be falsified. The problem is, and the problem that we've been haggling over is different, though. The explanations from theism for types of evil that I've heard, those haven't been falsified. Those can't be falsified. It sounds like you agree.
well, because those are entailments, right? So, but yeah. Anyways,
But you're saying that the heat death of the universe, that would be an entailment. But
Right.
the thing is it that entailment you could falsify, right?
Well, yeah. Again, my argument was you can falsify theism if you can show that there is an indefeasible evil, right? So yeah. Anyways, that's my closing thing.
Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and move to questions from the chat. I got a few starts. So if y'all want to keep on sending me your questions, chat. I believe I have 23 people watching. You're free to ask. Some of these started way back, an
No, that's
hour
fine.
ago. So they might be, not exactly related to what you were just immediately discussing, but still good questions. So Bread of Life asks, Joe, can't humans also be indirectly responsible for natural evil?
So the example I gave of social evil, it seems like it relates to this question, right? You can have the collective action of humans, humans who just want to get selfies with the dolphin. You can have that result in pain and suffering and a gratuitous evil, the dolphin. Yeah, I agree. That's just another type of evil that's not disconfirmed by the God hypothesis. It's just another type of evil that shows that God doesn't exist in the problem of evil.
All right, Kyle, did you want to say anything to that?
No, not really. I mean, one example I gave in my video is the climate change. So a lot of natural evil that happens today is indirectly responsible with humans' activities. But yeah, I don't have much to respond to that.
All right, next question. For you, Kyle, who is responsible for natural evils? Is it logically possible for God to achieve his goals without such evils?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. It does, I think, in order to sort of explain natural evils, you are going to need a theodicy, right? As long as, I mean, I think the defeat conditions sort of neutralize the evidence, but I also think when it comes to God justifying reasons or God's justifying reason for allowing natural evils, I would argue along the lines of Swinburne that there are natural evils. Well, there's two parts to this. So one is that I hold to a sort of cosmic soul building view where the whole universe sort of evolved its own, and that it's more likely that God would sort of create an autonomous creation. So there's that, and then also the consideration that there are certain moral, I guess, virtues that could not be grown if there wasn't any natural evils. And so if God is to maximize virtues, right, then God sort of, by necessity, God would have to sort of at least create a world where there's natural evils of a certain intensity, right? So yeah, basically that would be my response, where I would say that it's not logically possible for God to achieve his goals without such evils. Now, of course, there is a consideration about the defeat condition. So as long as, God, as long as God only permits defeatable evils, and God is authorized to allow for those evils, even if those evils are unnecessary in the grand scheme of things. So
All right. Joe, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so this has to do with a specific example that was given earlier. I asked if it was the case that God could create a world where just one less baby dolphin dies in the way that was described in my example, and I didn't hear any reason why that world is logically impossible. That's a world where there's one less instance of evil, right? So the issue is that there hasn't been any there hasn't been any explanation for why that world is logically impossible. Now, to focus this question, though, I do think that logical possibility is an issue with the problem of evil, but in the evidential sense, it just gets worse. It's not that it's that God is disconfirmed by all these amounts of evil. That's what I mean. Does that make sense?
All right. Well, I don't know, Kyle. It's okay. If you want to,
I wouldn't mind if he wants to respond. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it either. But if you wanted to give a response, then we'll move on to the next question. Otherwise,
no.
Next question is, again, Adam is asking a question for you. Is it logically for you, Kyle? Is it logically possible for God? Okay, so this has to do with more. Is it logically possible? So logical possibility for God to have created a world where people always freely choose the good, while still retaining libertarian free will. If not, why not?
So I actually do respond to this sort of objection in my video. I guess I don't want to get too much into details on my response to that, but there are three criteria for, I would argue that there's three main criteria for establishing actual genuine free creatures, right? So the first one would be theistic determination, where God has to sort of create a world that is not predetermined in any sort of way. So it's sort of autonomous, right? That's where you get the autonomous creation idea, right? So that autonomous creation idea would sort of entail that there is going to be a long causal history to the universe, but it's also going to entail that that you will have creatures emerge over time, right? And so with that, then you're going to have an initial range of, evil states of affairs. The second consideration for moral freedom would be self-determination, right? And I hold to the source code view of free will, so I reject the principle of alternative possibilities. So I hold that, as long as the source of their free will comes from themselves, then they're free to act upon it. And then the third condition would be the what's it called? Flourishing. So flourishing is just the soul building idea, right? And so my whole, and this goes into ultimate responsibility, right? So if God were to create creatures that always really choose the good, I would argue that he would have to sort of predetermine them to do so, right? That their perfect moral characters are predetermined to sort of only act upon the good. And I would argue that that is not a genuine state of affairs, that there has to be, at least initially, a sort of, in order to have like ultimate responsibility, you're going to have creatures that actually have genuine, what's called genuine moral free will. Like there's one option they can choose good or bad, right? So it has to be morally significant freedom, right? And that they develop, eventually they do, when you go to heaven, like eventually, yes, you do get to a point where you only choose the good, right? But that's only because in the initial stages that they were able to freely develop their characters on their own without God sort of building in this perfect moral character. So yes, I think while it is possible, so again, it is possible for God to create such a world, I would argue that God has overriding metanormative motivations to not create a world like that, and that there's good considerations as to why God would create a world like ours, where there are sort of initial, there's initial morally significant freedom. So yeah.
All right. Joe, did you want to say something to the question? Respond to the question?
Yeah. So I have a couple things to say. Look, I do agree that there's a problem with the type of free will required to undermine the logical problem of evil. And because there's a problem with that type of free will, I think that the logical problem of evil holds. But to make it more relevant to this debate, we're talking about, I was giving the evidential problem of evil. The evidential problem of evil deals with gratuitous evil. And so the evidential problem of evil is pointing out that the explanation for evil by the theist doesn't cut it. And so this idea that it's logically possible that goodness can that good and evil can be the result of libertarian free will is not a good explanation. It's much less likely compared to alternative explanations for the amounts of evil we see in the world. The other point I'll make, though, that has to do with his question specifically dealing with logical possibility is I want people to think about this idea of heaven. Heaven is a world where there are free agents that always choose to do a good. That seems like a logically possible world with free will, the type of free will that theists are committed to. And the problem is, why is that world not created? Why the fact that our world was created instead contradicts this idea of theism.
All right. We're going to go to the next question for time's sake. This is a question for Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A question for Joe. Given Kyle's overall approach to the problem of evil, don't you think God can allow for worser worlds, one less suffering, Dolphin?
No.
Because it's defeatable?
Oh, well, the thing is that when I asked, how is it defeated? It was this idea of an animal purgatory was invoked. Now, I think that hypotheses that do not invoke unfalsifiable like entailment such as that don't have unfalsifiable auxiliary hypotheses are the better hypotheses. The hypothesis of indifference accommodates all manner of hypotheses that can explain why the one example of a dolphin suffering occurred, and it can explain it without it being something that's unfalsifiable. So I think that because it's defeatable is an issue, because the way that it's defeated is in a way that's unfalsifiable. If it's unfalsifiable, then I would not prefer it. I would prefer a theory that has auxiliary hypotheses, or it has entailments that you can use as auxiliary hypotheses that are falsifiable.
All right, Kyle?
Yeah, so again, I would just sort of argue that entailments are not auxiliary hypotheses, because I'm not building that as part of the theoretical content of theism. So I would argue that, the afterlife is sort of an entailment of theism rather than it being sort of built in. So that's my only response to that.
All right. For Kyle, someone was wondering what you lean towards in terms of the afterlife.
So I actually do lean towards the universalist position. I'm not committed to it, but I'm definitely not an annihilationist. In fact, I would argue annihilationism is is an undefeatable evil, in the sense that I think that non-existence is an evil. If that can't be defeated, then that would be problematic for my sort of view. So even though I do lean more towards the universalist camp, I I don't like necessarily hold to the universalist camp, because I do think that I hold to sort of the eternal conscious torment view, which is creatures that will just constantly reject God, right? They will just constantly do bad actions and not pursue the good. And so on that sort of account, then yeah, I think I'm sort of fighting myself between the eternal causes torment and the universalist camp. I do lean more towards universalism, but I'm definitely not an annihilationist, so I would not go there. I hope that answers the question, but yeah.
All right. Did you want to say anything to that, Joe, or do you want to go proceed?
Yeah, I want to use this to highlight the point that I've been making that seems to be like it's not addressed. The evidential problem of evil is asking which is more likely. The way that you show that a hypothesis is more or less likely is you evaluate whether or not it fits with background knowledge, if or it's more simple. If it's more simple, it's something that can be falsifiable. It's something, and the thing is that I don't understand how you could say the theistic explanation is the more likely explanation if it entails like something like the existence of heaven or hell that people aren't even 100% sure on. People have to say they're nihilists. People have to say they're universalists. The idea that an explanation that has such a vague conditions to it being the better explanation blows my mind.
And that kind of brings us to this question. So this is question for Kyle, and it sort of will be a type of response to what Joe just said. How does theodicy give theism an explanatory advantage when such claims make theism less modest than naturalism? Making additional claims lowers the intrinsic / prior probability of theism.
Right. So one of the I mean, we didn't talk too much about priors in this debate, but I do think that I would probably reject Draper's characterization of simplicity, first of all. So there's a few I know Trent Dowdery sort of critiques a lot of at least in a footnote, he presents a sort of few reasons to doubt at least Draper's sort of criteria, at least of modesty and simplicity, right? Let me see if I don't want to spend too much time on this question, but I do think that it's a good question because, which type of criteria should we be using? And I actually do not accept Draper's view of simplicity. I take a sort of content theoretic approach to simplicity, where it's about the kinds of entities you're positing in your metaphysical your fundamental metaphysical explanation, and it's also about the number of entities themselves, so the number of properties that that you're positing. For some reason, I can't find Trent's criticism of Draper on this. So I apologize if I can't give a full response to why I reject Draper's method here. But yeah, so my general point here is that I take a theoretic approach to simplicity, then I would actually reject Draper's modesty and coherence criteria. There's a few reasons I don't want to get into on that. So again, because I hold to the theoretical information view, then the way that I look at simplicity is how many kinds you're positing and then how many entities themselves you're positing. And there's a paper written by Joshua Shijiwadi on this, where he goes over simplicity, and he argues that when you compare theism and then you compare, there's two versus naturalism. So you got the prior to modism view and the prior pluralism view. He argues that given the simplicity there, that it would actually favor theism, given that on theism, you have one entity with zero properties, whereas on naturalism, you have to posit at least one kind of entity, right, with many, many properties on a sort of priority modus view, or if you go to prior pluralist view, you're going to have to posit, I think it's many entities with one kind of one kind of thing. So yeah, my general response to this is that I just don't accept Draper's criteria when it comes to the prior probability of theism. I think that there are other less problematic criteria when addressing the prior probability of theism. So, and then of course, finally, my final response is that, an entailment, that there's an afterlife, that's not an auxiliary hypothesis. Just because the hypothesis of theism entails more things to exist, just because it entails an afterlife, does not mean that it's going to decrease the prior probability. And the reason for that is because it's a logical entailment. It's not being built in to the hypothesis. So that's my general response to that.
All right, Joe, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I appreciate this question because and Kyle's answer, because it made me kind of realize another angle that's to show why not being able to deal with the problem that's being given, or this is what it sounds like I'm hearing, that because it's a logical entailment of theism, it can't be seen as an auxiliary hypothesis. The issue is that a classic theodicy that's given again and again, is the fact that there's an afterlife where a goodness condition obtains. So it's not crazy for the person who asked the question. It's not crazy for me to treat that response, that there's an afterlife, as a theodicy. It's treated as a theodicy in philosophy of religion, and it still can be treated as a auxiliary hypothesis to the God hypothesis. So the other thing I want to mention is you're not what he says isn't necessarily, I guess. Well, is maybe I shouldn't say that, because I'm not sure if this person and you have interacted before and talked about Draper's naturalism. So maybe I shouldn't say that this isn't something that you're committed to on other positions. This might be a question specific to Draper. But the point here is that, look, it's a theodicy that's seen as an auxiliary hypothesis to the theistic hypothesis. Having a theodicy that is unfalsifiable is a problem. We would prefer hypotheses that don't have auxiliary hypotheses that are unfalsifiable. So we wouldn't prefer theism.
All right, with that, we're going to go to our closing statements. Kyle is going to go first with the closing statement, and then Joe will close us out. Let's go for about 5 minutes of a closing statement, if that's fine. That's good. Yeah. Right, and that brings us around to a nice around 2 hours. Thanks for being here, guys. I really appreciate y'all's participation, and thanks for chat. I put a poll in chat about where the chat kind of leans towards theism or atheism. So for people that are interested in doing that poll, go ahead and get yourself over to the chat. But with that, we're going to go with Kyle's closing statement. And then we'll proceed with Joe's.
Okay, so one of the I think one of the very big disagreements that me and Joe had were, I think we're using different criteria when assessing this, right? So the way that I look at simplicity, the way I look at priors, right, is that you have a sort of information theoretic view, right? It's not about modesty, it's not about necessarily coherence, given what Draper, given that's Draper's method. I don't necessarily accept that sort of view of simplicity. I accept a more information theoretic approach. So you want to make sure that you posit the less kinds of entities and also the less number of entities, right? So I'd argue that you have one entity with zero properties, right? That's what theism sort of entails. And then you have naturalism, which either you have many entities, many foundational entities with one kind of entity, right, given the natural, or you have one kind of entity with many different kinds of entities within it. So again, I would recommend you guys read Joshua Shijawadi's paper on that. He presents this sort of argument. So the way that I look at entailments, so the way that I look at this is like, okay, we have the simplicity there given the information theoretic approach. Theism is simple. And then what can we expect from that, right? And so my general point here is that given the defeat condition, then God is authorized to allow any amount of evil as long as it's defeatable, right? So it doesn't matter how much evil there is, right? It doesn't matter, like, okay, it's true that God could create a world where one less dolphin dies or something like that. But the point here is that as long as the evil is defeatable, then God is authorized to allow it. And it's not like that world is better just because it has one less fun. And again, the reason for that is because we're using a different axiology. We're using an axiology of virtue ethics. We're also constrained by the defeat condition on this scenario, and so that's not going to really present any problems there, right? So yeah, the prior probability, I would just disagree with Draper on that, and I don't think that entailments are an auxiliary hypothesis just because theism entails more commitments about the world does not mean that the prior probability is low. Okay, so yeah, that's just my general response. And again, I mean, if you look at I think that if you look at my response, my last 2 points, we didn't get too much into theodicy, unfortunately. But I would recommend that people watch my video on, it's called The Explanatory Flexibility of Theism, where I go a lot into this and I present sort of my criteria for what is an ad hoc hypothesis, what's not an ad hoc hypothesis, and so forth. So I don't know, I think maybe the main disagreements between me and Joe here are just going to be methodology and how we look at this, right? And I think that given the defeat condition, that theism does not make false predictions, because I don't think there are any examples of indefeasible evils, given that within the theistic resources, you can sort of explain this evil in terms of defeat, right? And in order for the problem of evil to work, you have to work within the theistic resources, right? And if those theistic resources can actually explain evil, at least equally as well as naturalism, then it's not going to really be an issue. At least the problem of evil is not going to be an issue for theism. So, and of course, I would argue that we didn't get too much into this, but I would argue that theism, given a theodicy, is actually better able to explain evil, given the sort of value mapping that I talked about near the end of my opening statement. So again, if you want more information on at least my general views on this, check out my channel. So yeah, that'll be it.
I just kicked you out like on accident. Let's get Joe in here. Subscribe to Kyle's channel. Christian Idealism. There's a lot of content there, so especially if you're theistically minded. But I think there's also a discussion between Kyle and I, but I don't know where that is. You're gonna have to scour the internet for that one. But about explanation and theism. So thanks again for coming over, Kyle. Let's go ahead and get Joe in, and we'll kind of wrap it up. Okay.
So this was, I haven't done this in a while, so this was fun, Danny. I appreciate you hosting this. I appreciate Kyle agreeing to this debate. You guys should subscribe to his YouTube channel. My YouTube channel just has a bunch of videos of me playing Overwatch, so you guys shouldn't subscribe to that. Let's recapitulate. Let's draw together the threads of the debate. I'm going to focus on the things I said in my initial response, and then I'm going to elaborate the insights that Kyle gave throughout the back and forth. So I said that there's a God, and that God has these certain properties. Kyle agreed with me about that, about the definition of that God. Now, I gave the evidential problem of evil, which says that there are gratuitous evils. The fact that they exist disconfirms the existence of God. It disconfirms the God hypothesis, is another way of putting it. Now, the thing is that there are theodicies that are offered by the theists, but we either didn't hear them, or the one theodicy that was covered throughout the discussion was either agreed to be unfalsifiable, or it was taken to not be an actual theodicy. That to me just doesn't address the issue. The issue is that the God hypothesis needs to better account for the evil we see in the world. If there are accounts for the evil we see in the world that don't have unfalsifiable auxiliary hypotheses, which is what the theodicy of there being an afterlife is, then that's an explanation that is way less simplistic compared to alternative explanations. Alternative explanations of instances of evil better account for our observations of the world. We should prefer those to the theistic explanation. We should reject a theistic explanation, and so it's a huge problem if the theist explanation for evil should be rejected. The problem of evil shows that theism is unlikely. Given that it's unlikely, we should reject the existence of the God of theism. And so that's why I'm an atheist. That's why I think the problem of evil is very profound. And again, Danny, I really appreciate this debate. This was a lot of fun.
All right, guys. Thank you all so much for coming on and participating in chat and stuff. We're close to 1,000 subscribers. So if you have not subscribed and you're watching, please do. I don't know if you know YouTube rules, but at 1,000, you're monetized. And I really want half of my Netflix subscription paid for. Okay. So please do that. Yeah, thanks again, Kyle and Joe, for coming on. Y'all have a great day.